Our scripture lesson this morning comes to us from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, beginning in verse 19. This is the story of Thomas's experience of the risen Christ. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And he said this. After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said again, "Peace be with you. And as the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. And if you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hand, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. And although the door was shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have heard and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these were written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The last couple of weeks, I've been spending a lot of time in the last chapters of the book of John. John's gospel is, I think most of you will know, very unique among the gospels. We have the four gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, share a great deal in common. There are many stories that they share together. There are some that each of them uniquely tell, some that each of them share about Jesus, but maybe with a particular focus on it. It looks a little different when you read it in Luke as opposed to Matthew sometimes. But John's gospel is the most unique of the four. John's gospel was written to and from out of the church in Jerusalem. It was in that community that this gospel particularly came out of, and is reflected of some of the very core values of that church community. You know, churches are different. If you visit one congregation and visit another, they will differ. We all celebrate and worship the one Lord, but we all have different ways that we focus on that and we celebrate it and recognize it. And for the writer of John's gospel, that writer particularly reflects the values of that Jerusalem church. And there were two primary things that were of utmost importance: faith in Jesus and love of the community. Jesus' great commandment that you shall love one another as I have loved you. That is the commandment that church was to be defined by. More than any other value, those two, faith in Jesus and love that was experienced and expressed within the beloved community. I've been reading through this part over and over again, really close, because it seems so dear to us about this relationship. And The author this gospel is never made totally clear. Sometimes we talk about this author being John, one of the disciples. It could have been John, who was one of the 12. It could have been another John who maybe was a little younger and was a leader in that church, we know, until as late as the 90s AD, as much as 60 years after Jesus' death. It could have been either of those two. What we know is that it was reflective of a person that came out of that community and how they shared the perspective of the early church about Jesus and that value of love. What we know is that several times in the gospel, there's described a disciple who was the one whom Jesus loved, right? The one whom Jesus loved, the beloved. Again, a part of this beloved community. It says that even on that last night that they were with Jesus, that the one whom Jesus loved was reclining, leaning against Jesus with his head on his chest. And was thinking about that. I mean, wouldn't it be amazing to have that kind of relationship with Jesus, that you just rested so assured that you could lay your head on his chest and know that he is the one who embraces you. And in him, you have your identity, and it does not matter what any other view of you or yourself the world might have, that you are beloved. And it meant that every person in the church was to experience that relationship with Jesus so central to their lives that it gave them the definition of who they are. And no member of the community, no matter how wealthy they were, how poor they were, no matter how upstanding or how deep a sinner they were loved by God and therefore loved by the community. And that radical sense of God's love that embraced everyone was the defining feature of who that church was and their understanding of who Jesus is in our life. I think that's pretty amazing. Because when we come to our story today about Thomas, what we come to know is that Thomas was one of the fiercest lovers of Jesus. He said during the course of Jesus' life that Jesus began to talk about his death, and he said, if you are to die, then we will go with you. I will go with you. He was committed to following Jesus to the end. And this kind of fierce faith is one of the things that we know about Thomas. One of the other things that we think is true of Thomas is that we believe that his ministry carried him on to carry the gospel all the way to India. What we know is that from early on, whenever Westerners came to India, there were those who believed in Jesus that were already there and welcomed them. And that among those early Christians that were there in India, the name Thomas is one that is very familiar and one that many Christians carry. And it fits with the stories that were told even in India that Thomas had carried the message of Jesus all the way to India. It's amazing, a beautiful story of a life lived with so much faith, and yet his life is often defined by one word in this scripture, and that is doubt. We refer to doubting Thomas in a way that's negative, but I think maybe if we take another look at that, we see something larger, something bigger for us to look at. Paul Martin was a Methodist minister, later became a bishop in the Methodist church in Texas. And when he was early in his ministry and appointed to a new church, and as often is the case, after that first Sunday and worship together, they gathered in the fellowship hall and they had a reception. Everybody was greeting the new pastor. And he noticed one man who stood back in the back of the room and just kind of kept his distance and never really had an opportunity to speak with him until the reception was over and people were leaving, and then he went up and introduced himself, and the guy introduced himself, and so Paul Martin asked him, he said, now, what's your role? What do you do here in the church? And the guy said, My job is to watch the pastor and to find his weakness. And I'm really good at it. I can find the pastor's weakness easy. And then what I do is I go and I stand beneath him in that area and uphold him and support him so that he's able to serve at his greatest strength. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Because sometimes what we look for in our native instinct is to look for weakness to exploit. But here is someone who looked for weakness in order to find that place where they could help and support not just that person, but in doing so, as the pastor, support the whole ministry of the church by finding that place of weakness. You know what that does for pastors too? If they hear that, not that the place of weakness is where they're going to be most vulnerable, but the place where other people are going to lend their strength and be able to help share and support in the ministry. That just gives them the greatest confidence to be able to share in ministry together. What was the expectation in that story became the opposite. That where our weaknesses sometimes can be the place where in community our greatest strength can be brought forward and shared. It says of the disciples that they were gathered together. They were gathered together for fear. They were afraid, and so they were held up together in the upper room. Not knowing what to do, Jesus had died. They had not yet. They had heard stories of his resurrection. They had heard from the women. They had heard, but they hadn't experienced Jesus' presence yet. And they're fearful. And they're gathered there, and Jesus appears to them in their fear and provides them their greatest strength. It's easy to be in the role of a critic, isn't it? It's easy to be able to sit back and be in the role of one who sees the weakness and be able to point it out. It's a whole nother ministry to be able to allow yourself to move past that to a place where we are all together on one team and we see how we share in ministry together. They were in fear, and that could have been seen as their weakness, and yet Jesus came to them precisely because that's where they were. They were in that place of fear and uncertainty about what it is to do next, and Jesus came to them and shared his love and his peace. Whenever we are fearful, whenever maybe been on work at the job and you made a mistake or two, instead of living with great confidence in your work, usually you kind of withdraw, don't you? If you feel like you maybe are in a little bit of danger, rather than making yourself more visible, you often want to withdraw and to pull back, rather than being outgoing in your life and in your faith and job. We are reactionary when we become fearful. We are much more instinctual in that fight or flight mode. Whenever we feel fear, we want to either, whenever something feels like it's dangerous, we either want to fight back or leave because of the fear. We live by instinct whenever we live in fear. And that's where the disciples were, living in reaction, either to want to run out and fight for Jesus or to withdraw and leave because of fear. But Jesus comes and he says to him, "Peace. My peace I give to you." Whenever we feel fear in our lives is when we need to most be reminded that we are his and that he has claimed us, and we can rest assured in that peace. Fear is never a good motivator. Fear may get us to change our behavior on one time, but it's never a good place to live because it just creates anxiety and it creates reactionary living. Jesus wants us to live with peace in our life rather than fear. He wants us to live with peace because when we have that peace, we always will be able to express our faith faith most clearly, rather than be in that critical role. And when we've experienced a lot in our life, we tend to want to do it to others too. You know, if you've ever, kind of experienced a person or some others kind of finding fault in yourself, in you want to then begin look and find it in everybody else as well. Well, maybe I'm not great, but I'm not as bad as that person, right? We want to try to find a way to make ourselves feel better, sometimes by comparison. And we can do that. We can all find someone who's not got it together a little less than ourselves. But that is not the place where Jesus wants us to live. Jesus wants us to live with no fear in our lives, not with a sense of fear over our heads. Fear doesn't inspire. Fear causes us to move more deeply within. Now, Thomas, I don't know if it means that he was without fear, that he wasn't with the 12 or the other disciples when they were gathered together. It said they were gathered together for fear, yet Thomas wasn't there. Maybe he wasn't living in that place of fear. What we do know is that he was struggling to believe after Jesus had come to the rest of the disciples and spoken to them. And when they gave testimony to Thomas, he just could not imagine it. He could not imagine it. I mean, people do not come back from the dead. When someone has died, they do not come back. How in the world is he expected to believe that Jesus has returned? Because people don't do that. And yet here they are giving testimony that he was here. He's saying, I'm glad for you that you had that experience, but I'm not going to believe it until I can touch it, till I can touch his hand and his side, and I can know for certain. I'm not going to believe these rumors that he's back. I need to see it. I need to experience it. Doubt can be something that holds us back in our lives. But doubt also can be the thing that causes us to question and to push deeper to truer answers. I think for Thomas, we shouldn't look at him as one who lacked faith. I think he had lots of faith. Doubt just helps him to get to the place of his deepest faith. Doubt is a tool for him in his life to come to the place of a deepest trust. Because he's not going to be sucked in by any easy scam. He's not going to be sucked in by whatever miracle kind of thing it is on TV they're advertising. I mean, don't you love those great little gadgets they sell on TV, sold only on TV, and they chop and slice and dice and do amazing things. I'm ready to sign up every time I see one because they look so wonderful. But we all know once we bought one of those things that they don't measure up, and they didn't solve all the problems of our life by getting them. I remember for me, when I came to that awakening in my life, I loved to read cartoon, the comic books like every kid, and I ordered sea monkeys from the back, and they did not look anything like the sea monkeys in the picture. I remember. They just these little squirmy things. They didn't form a family and do all those things like we're in the picture. I just thought I was incredibly disappointed. Sea monkeys was the day I came to realize you cannot trust everything you see. We can become doubtful in life. We ought to be doubting. We ought to doubt most of the promises that people in the world will give us because they will all fall short. But what Thomas learns is there's one thing that if you doubt, it will lead you to deeper answers, and that's Jesus. He doubted Jesus. He had disbelief, and yet it pushed him to a place of deeper faith because Jesus was not giving up on him. Jesus was going to let that experience draw him closer to the point where when Jesus comes again, he says, see, touch. Know what you need to know so that you can believe. It's an amazing story. The stories in the end of the Gospel of John are so personal. So personal. Whenever Mary comes to the tomb and she doesn't see him, she just sees that it's empty, and the gardener, she thinks, speaks to her, and then she realizes it's Jesus. A personal faith that lets her understand at the most intimate way that Jesus is risen. A Jesus who comes back to Peter whenever Peter has denied him 3 times. And whenever they have the conversation at the end, Jesus asks him, how many times do you love me? He asks 3 times in a way to affirm his love for Jesus for every time that he denied him. So personal to let Peter have this reconnection in that way. And then for Thomas, the gospel says to us, Jesus did a lot of other things. He did a lot of other things in his life and in his ministry that didn't get recorded here. In fact, later on it says, I suppose the libraries of the world cannot contain all the books that would be written if we put down everything about Jesus' life. I think that's an amazing statement, because here we have these very personal experiences in which Jesus reaches out to someone who's questioning, to someone who's doubting, to someone who's struggling, and he allows them to get back on board and their life to be regained and their sense of perspective in faith reestablished. Every one of them is given a new chance. Now, it doesn't tell us the story of every person, because we couldn't put them all together. The whole world wouldn't be able to contain all the stories that are there. It says, but these were written so that you might have faith and believe. Amazing. Amazing incidences in Jesus' life and ministry that are shared. The thing is, faith and knowledge are 2 very different things. Doubt is not counter to faith. Fear is what's counter to faith. What's counter to doubt is what we would have as fact or science. It's knowledge. Knowledge and doubt are the 2 things that balance each other off. Faith is what you have. Faith is a trust when you can't know for certain. Faith is what allows you to step out when you cannot know. We cannot know 2,000 years later that Jesus rose from the dead. What we can know is the faith that we experience in our lives. We have to trust in that because we have experienced resurrection in our own lives. We have seen it in the lives of those who have believed and are a part of our lives. Faith is trusting and stepping out when we don't have all knowledge to sufficiently come to trust something. Knowledge is about something different. There's a beautiful story that Carl Sandburg tells. Story of a boy who was working hard to pull a weed out of the ground, and finally he got it out, and his mom says, "You're so strong to be able to do that." And he smiles and he says, "Yeah, I know. The whole world was holding it back." Doesn't it feel that way sometimes, that the whole world is holding it back? It's you pulling on this weed and the world pulling on the other side, and you're trying to make it through. Faith is something bigger than all that we would ever stand against, all the disbelief that we would have in our lives. From the inside, faith allows us to see and to believe. From the inside of faith, you can trust because your heart knows you can trust. From the outside, faith may look like silliness. How can you believe or trust in that from a scientific view? We can't. We can't know that for certain. But from a faith perspective, you know how deeply it's right. That God is with us, that God stands with us. Whenever we can't see all the pieces with knowledge, faith is what allows us to believe. And this story, as it concludes, it says that it's written. So, Jesus says to Thomas, I'm glad that you now in seeing believe. But this story is written for those who will never have a chance to see, so that they can believe without seeing. That's what we have in our lives. That's what this story is written for us for. It's written for you and for me because we'll never be able to see Jesus resurrected from the grave in that sense. But we see Jesus resurrected in people's lives all the time. When someone who has gotten off track manages to put it together again, we can trust that there's resurrection power going on in their life. We can see and believe in all that has happened. There's a story about a monk who had staved up all his life to be able to make a trip. He wanted to go to Jerusalem, and he wanted to see the tomb where Jesus was buried. Throughout his ministry, he didn't make much money, but he saved up little by little, and he began this journey to go. And as he just begins to go, he sees a man alongside the road. And the man is there, and he's begging for help. And he asks him, where are you going? And he tells him, I'm going to Jerusalem because I want to go and to see where Jesus was buried. I want to see the empty tomb, and I want to march around it, and I want to pray. And the man says to him, he says, why don't you just march around me and pray for me so that me and my family might have food to eat? Begins to think about it. And you know what he did? He gave the money that he had saved up for this long journey he was to make. He gave it to that gentleman so that he and his family might have food to eat. And he prayed with him. That monk never got to make the trip to Jerusalem in his life. He didn't ever get to go see where Jesus was buried. But you know what he got to see? He got to see where Jesus is living. He got to see where Jesus is living in that man and that family's life. God comes to bring us resurrection, life, and power. And Thomas is one of these stories that helps us to trust in what God is doing, how God is at work in our life and the life of others. Maybe we won't ever see the tomb where Jesus was buried, but I trust that we'll see the place where he's living. If we just look deep within, we'll see all that God has done to resurrect our lives and to give us a second chance. Amen.